Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Long-haul truckers. What's the creepiest, most paranormal thing you've seen on the road at night? Story 1. Desert lights.
My father has spent countless hours on the road, hauling logs through Idaho and navigating the desolate highways of Utah and Nevada. Over the years, he has shared many eerie stories, but two stand out as the most chilling. The first occurred while he was driving his pickup truck through the dark deserts of Utah on a moonless night. As he cruised along the highway, a mysterious light appeared in the distance. It seemed to be pacing him, hovering just beyond the edge of the road. For a full minute, the light kept steady alongside him before vanishing abruptly. At the exact moment the light disappeared, his truck suddenly shut off, leaving him stranded in the silence of the desert. Panicked but determined, he managed to restart the vehicle and continued driving until he reached the nearest diner. When he shared his experience with the locals, they casually explained that such occurrences were common in the area, as though it was just another part of life in the desert. To this day, the light remains an unsettling mystery. The second story took place during a snowy winter night in Idaho, near the Coeur d'Alene area. My father was hauling logs and preparing to descend a steep mountain grade. As he stepped out of his truck to put on tire chains, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he felt as though unseen eyes were watching his every move. Halfway down the switchbacks, his headlights illuminated a massive figure standing atop a 20-foot embankment. The creature, with shoulders as tall as his truck cab, moved with unnatural agility. In a single fluid motion, it leaped down the embankment and crossed to the other side with ease. Terrified, my father kept driving without stopping, only removing the chains once he was far from the mountain. To this day, he cannot explain what he saw. Whether it was a cryptid like Sasquatch or something far more sinister, the experience left an indelible mark on him, a chilling reminder of the unknown lurking in the wilderness.
Story 2. Burned woman.
I live in Spokane, Washington, which is about 45 minutes away from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. One night I was driving home from my aunt's house, and the darkness of the rural roads seemed to stretch endlessly. The only sound was the faint hum of my car engine as I navigated the winding roads. Then, without warning, I drove into a massive wall of fog. It was thick, almost suffocating, reducing my visibility to just a few feet ahead. As I turned a corner, the fog seemed to part just enough for me to see what was ahead. A herd of deer suddenly appeared, running down the road directly toward me. My heart leaped into my throat. I immediately slowed the car, gripping the wheel tightly to avoid hitting them. The deer scattered as I rolled forward cautiously, their shapes disappearing back into the mist. Just as my heartbeat began to settle, I saw her. A woman stood in the middle of the road, facing away from me. Her clothes were dirty and tattered, and she stood unnaturally still. The fog swirled around her, making the scene look almost unreal. Given the area, which is known for its struggles with drug addiction, I assumed she might need help. I cracked my window and called out to her, asking if she needed me to contact someone for assistance. The moment my voice broke the silence, her head whipped around and I froze. Her face was horrifying. Her skin was mottled and scarred, as if she were a burn victim. She had huge lidless eyes that stared directly at me, no eyebrows, a flattened nose, and a mouth that looked melted or sewn shut. For a moment, time seemed to stop as she stared at me, unblinking. Then, without warning, she turned and ran into the woods with unnatural speed, vanishing into the fog as quickly as she had appeared. My hands were shaking as I pressed the accelerator harder than I should have and drove straight home, not daring to look back. To this day, I cannot explain what I saw. Was she a lost soul, a supernatural entity, or simply a tragic victim of circumstance? All I know is that I will never forget her face.
Story 3. Dormitory Ghost.
During my first month at boarding school, I stayed in a different dorm from the one I would later move to. My bunk was a top bunk, positioned right in the middle of the room. One afternoon I decided to take a nap. As I drifted off to sleep, I dangled my arm over the side of the bed. I do not remember what I was dreaming about, but what happened next is as clear to me now as it was then. I was abruptly awakened by the sound of a cat hissing and then screaming. Before I could fully process what was happening, I felt an intense pain on my finger. Someone or something bit me hard enough to leave a bruise beneath my nail. The pain jolted me awake completely. Startled, I looked around the room and realized I was utterly alone. I had been sleeping on my stomach, with my arm hanging down, so there was no way I could have done it to myself in my sleep. The dorms were separated by a single half wall. Thinking perhaps someone had sneaked over to play a prank, I got up to investigate. I checked the other side of the wall but found no one. As I stood there trying to make sense of it all, I suddenly heard a loud bang on the wall right by my bunk. Once again, I was completely alone. There were other stories too, especially from the girls' dorm. Their dorm was located near a small pond on campus, and it was said that a little girl's ghost haunted the area. According to them, she would run through the bathroom screaming, leaving behind wet footprints. One day, while we were near the pond, a group of girls came running out of their dorm, still wrapped in towels, screaming about the ghost. A female staff member went inside to check, and I will never forget the expression on her face when she came back out. It was a strange half smile, the kind you make when you cannot explain what you just saw. She simply said, "Yes, there are children's footprints in there."
Story 4. The Phantom on the Highway.
It was a quiet night when my two friends and I set off on a long drive from Laredo, Texas, to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in my trusty Ford van. The journey was uneventful until we found ourselves on a particularly desolate stretch of highway just outside Laredo. This section of road is infamous for its darkness. No buildings, no towns, no lights for about 50 miles. It was 2 a.m., and the oppressive silence seemed to envelop the van as we drove. I was in the right lane, approaching a large truck ahead of us. As we got closer, I decided to pass. Switching to the left lane, the truck loomed beside us as I slowly overtook it. That is when it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a sudden movement. The massive truck swerved sharply toward the right shoulder, its lights catching something or someone. My heart leapt as I realized why the truck was swerving. A figure, dressed entirely in white, was walking across the highway. The sight was chilling. The person, if it was a person, wore flowing white garments, their face pale and eerily featureless in the darkness. Their arms were folded across their chest, and their eyes were closed as though in some macabre trance. They moved deliberately, utterly unaware of the vehicles bearing down on them. I had no time to think. Instinctively, I swerved to the left, gripping the wheel tightly as the van veered dangerously close to the shoulder. The figure was so close that I could see every detail in the brief, harrowing moment as we passed. My passenger side mirror barely missed grazing them. The image of their closed eyes is seared into my memory. It was as if they were completely detached from reality, oblivious to the chaos they had caused. As soon as we were clear, I pulled the van back into the lane, my heart pounding. My friends and I sat in stunned silence, too shaken to speak. Who or what had we encountered on that dark highway? To this day, I do not have an answer, but the memory still haunts me.
Story 5. Silent Bride and Groom.
It was a chilly spring evening in northern New York. and my mum, sister, and I were driving to one of my baseball games during my junior year of high school. The main road we always took stretched about 35 miles, flanked by endless cornfields and dense tree lines. The setting was eerily quiet, with the early dusk casting long shadows over the road. As we drove, we encountered a strange patch of dense fog. It appeared suddenly, and without any apparent reason. My mum slowed the car to a safe speed, navigating cautiously through the thick, milky haze. The fog felt oppressive, muffling the sounds of the world outside. Finally, we emerged from the fog, and an eerie silence filled the car. As we passed the clearing, all three of us instinctively turned to look out the left window, curious to get our bearings. What we saw made our blood run cold. About 50 yards from the road, a man and a woman were walking hand in hand, their figures ghostly against the backdrop of the woods. They were dressed in what appeared to be wedding attire from over a century ago. The man wore a tall top hat, his suit formal and archaic, while the woman was draped in a long flowing white dress that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Their backs were to us as they walked silently toward the tree line, seemingly oblivious to our presence. None of us said a word as the car rolled past. The air inside felt heavy, charged with an unspoken dread. After what felt like an eternity, my mum broke the silence, her voice shaking slightly as she asked, "What was that?" Even now, years later, when we recount that night, the memory brings a wave of goosebumps. The figures on the edge of the woods remain an unsolved mystery, a chilling reminder of that haunting evening.
Story 6. Faceless Woman on the Dark Road.
My father has recounted this story several times, and each time it sends a chill down my spine. Although he was not a trucker, he experienced something unsettling during his time in the military. One night, he and a buddy decided to head out for some food. The road they took was long, dark, and eerily quiet. As they drove, they noticed a woman walking along the roadside. She wore a striking red dress, her black hair flowing in the dim light. Both my father and his friend found the situation peculiar. It was not a safe area for anyone to be walking, and the night was uncomfortably cold. Deep down, my father had a strong feeling that stopping was a terrible idea, but curiosity got the better of them. They slowed the car to get a better look, wondering if she needed help. As they passed her, they both froze in terror. The woman's face was missing. In its place was a gaping black void, as if her entire face had been erased. The horrifying sight shocked them to their cores. My father immediately pressed the gas pedal, speeding away from the chilling figure. They drove in silence, their hearts pounding, until they reached a diner to eat. As they sat at the table trying to make sense of what they had seen, they confirmed to each other that they both had witnessed the exact same thing. Their shared account only deepened their unease. While they were discussing the incident, a stranger overheard them and joined their conversation. The stranger revealed something that sent shivers down their spines. A woman had died in a car accident on that very stretch of road earlier that year. She had been disfigured in the wreck, and sightings of a mysterious woman in a red dress had become a common tale among locals. To this day, my father's story remains one of the most chilling accounts I have ever heard. The memory of the faceless woman and the eerie coincidence of her tragic backstory still haunt him. Whether she was a spirit seeking closure or an echo of a tragic event, the encounter was something neither he nor his friend could ever forget.
Story 7. Vanishing Passenger.
It was a quiet night, just me and the endless stretch of Route 66. The hum of my rig was the only sound as I hauled a load across the desert. The road was empty, bathed in the cold glow of moonlight. I liked these solitary drives, peaceful, almost meditative. That night, however, was anything but. Around 2 a.m., a faint silhouette appeared on the roadside. A woman stood there, motionless, with her thumb out in a classic hitchhiker's pose. She wore a white dress that fluttered slightly in the desert breeze, and her hair hung in dark, damp strands over her face. It was unusual to see anyone out here at this hour, and something about her felt off. But my sense of duty to help another human being overrode the unease creeping up my spine. I pulled over, and she climbed into the passenger seat without a word. Her presence chilled the air, and I noticed a faint dampness on the upholstery where she sat. I tried to make small talk, but she only nodded or shook her head in response. Her silence made the miles stretch endlessly. As we approached a bend in the road, she suddenly turned to me. Her face was pale, unnaturally so, and her eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to swallow the dim light inside the cab. She raised a hand, pointing toward the road ahead. "Be careful," she whispered in a voice that was both faint and chilling. Before I could respond, she vanished. Not opened the door or stepped out, just vanished, leaving nothing but a faint dampness on the seat. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing, and scanned the area with my flashlight. There was no trace of her, no footprints, nothing. Shaken, I continued driving. About a mile later, I rounded a curve and saw a pile-up of cars that had just occurred. If I had not slowed down, I might have been among the wreckage. To this day, I cannot explain who or what she was, but I owe her my life.
Story 8. Phantom of the Overpass.
It was a foggy night as I drove my rig along a remote stretch of highway deep in the Midwest. The kind of fog that clings to the road, swallowing everything beyond the reach of your headlights. The clock read 3:12 a.m., and apart from the rhythmic thrum of my tires, the world was silent. As I approached a crumbling old overpass, I noticed something strange. A figure stood at the edge, silhouetted against the mist. It looked like a person, but there was something wrong with the proportions, too tall, with limbs too long. My gut churned as I got closer. The figure did not move. It just stood there, leaning slightly over the edge, as if it was waiting for something or someone. My headlights illuminated the overpass just as I passed under it, and for a split second I saw its face, or rather, the absence of one. The figure had no features, just smooth, black emptiness where a face should be. I felt my stomach drop, but I kept driving, convincing myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of the fog or my tired eyes. But as I glanced in my side mirror, I saw it again. The figure was no longer on the overpass. It was standing on the shoulder of the road, directly in the path of my trailer. I gripped the wheel tighter, my pulse pounding in my ears. I did not stop. I could not. When I looked in my rearview mirror, it was gone. Thinking the worst was over, I let out a shaky breath, but the air in the cab turned icy cold. My radio, which had been off, crackled to life with static. A faint, distorted voice whispered something I could not make out, and then the radio went dead. I did not stop until I reached the next truck stop, where I sat shaking for what felt like hours. I asked around about the overpass, and an old-timer nodded grimly. "That road has seen its share of deaths," he said. "You're not the first to see it."
Story 9. Shadow that chased me.
It was close to 3 a.m., and I was hauling a load through the empty highways of West Texas. The road was straight, and the only light came from my truck's high beams slicing through the thick darkness. Ahead, I could see the silhouette of an overpass, a lonely structure in the middle of nowhere. As I approached, I noticed something odd. There was a figure standing on the edge of the overpass, motionless, as though staring down at the road. My pulse quickened. It was not unusual to see people in strange places at odd hours, but something about this figure felt. As I got closer, I realized the figure was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and unnaturally thin. It seemed more shadow than flesh. its edges shifting as though the darkness itself was alive. I slowed the truck slightly, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, but there was nowhere else to go. The figure moved. In one fluid motion, it dropped from the overpass and landed on the shoulder of the road ahead with a soundless grace that defied logic. My headlights caught it fully now, a humanoid shape but featureless, with an inky blackness that seemed to drink in the light. It turned its head, or what I thought was its head, toward me, and I swear I felt its gaze pierce through the windshield. My breath caught as it took a step onto the road. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck roared forward, but the shadowy figure moved with me, keeping pace effortlessly, gliding alongside the truck without touching the ground. I kept my eyes forward, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. When I dared to glance in the side mirror, I saw it, perched on the edge of the trailer, its head cocked as if studying me. The air in the cab grew frigid, my breath fogging up in front of me. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. No sound, no trace, only the lingering dread and the certainty that whatever it was, it let me go.
Story 10. Vanishing Tragedy.
It was a quiet night on a desolate stretch of highway in Montana, miles away from the nearest town. The stars were hidden behind thick clouds, and the road ahead was illuminated only by my high beams. I had been driving for hours, the monotony of the road lulling me into a trance-like state, when something broke the stillness. Ahead, on the shoulder of the road, I saw a car, a rusted sedan with its hazard lights blinking weakly. Smoke billowed from the hood, and beside it, a man and a woman were standing. The woman was frantically waving her arms, trying to flag me down, while the man knelt over someone sprawled on the ground. I slowed to a stop a few yards away, my instincts torn between caution and concern. As I stepped out of the cab, the woman's cries became clearer. "Help us, please," she screamed, her voice filled with desperation. The man looked up at me, his face pale and strained. "There's been an accident," he said. "We need to get her to a hospital." I moved closer, trying to make sense of the scene. The figure on the ground was a young girl, her face pale, her limbs unnaturally twisted. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the cracked asphalt. My stomach churned as I asked if they had called for help. The man shook his head. "No service out here," he muttered. I offered to drive them to the nearest town, but the woman shook her head violently. "No, you go get help. Hurry." Without another word, I got back into the cab and drove to the next rest area, which was about 15 minutes away. I told the clerk at the gas station about the accident, and they called the authorities. When the police and I returned to the scene, there was nothing there. No car, no people, no blood, just an empty stretch of road. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but there was no evidence to support what I had seen. To this day, I cannot explain it. I know what I saw, the desperation in their eyes, the girl's broken body, but it was as if the entire tragedy had been swallowed by the night, leaving me to question if it ever happened at all.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below, and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares, and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight, and remember, not all shadows are empty.